Welcome to Lifestyle by Design, helping you solve everyday challenges. I'm Karen Jacobs, an occupational therapist, a Brookline Rotarian, and a professor at Boston University. And here's my co-host.
Hi, and I'm Andrea Calso. And today we're very excited to have you join us and to meet our special guest, Kevin Love, an occupational therapist. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And today's very special because it's Pearl Harbor Day.
Yes, so it's obviously not a festive day, but it is a remembrance of those folks who experienced that awful event. And of course, it kicked off the Second World War, so it's kind of an important day to recall.
Yeah, so we're happy that you're here today. So I don't know very much about the military. My dad was in World War II, my uncle was, but they didn't talk much about it. I never got to see their uniforms, and only pictures. You have a very colorful uniform, so maybe could you describe the symbolism with some of what you have on your jacket?
Sure. Well, certainly this is a dress uniform as opposed to a combat or a work type uniform. So it is true. Typically in the military, people, when they meet you, if they're fellow military folks, they can actually tell essentially what you've done and where you've been. So for me, this uniform indicates first, of course, the rank, which is lieutenant colonel, so that tells people I'm an officer. It would tell you if you were sergeant or private or whatever. The band on here where you see the gold with the maroon indicates that I'm in a medical profession. So every group, like for green, that'd be infantry. For red, that's artillery. So people can actually tell what kind of job in a general way you do by looking at the color. That tells you that right away. Of course, some of the symbols on here on the sleeve, a lot of times you'll see slash marks or what are called hash marks on soldiers and sailors, Air Force folks. These indicates the number in 6-month increments that you've been overseas in a war zone. So for me, you can see it's been about 2 years that I spent in a hostile area, in this case, Iraq. Other things you see typically on a uniform, on this side you get things like obviously the name for the Army. These are called combat badges. So here, this would tell you right away if you see this on somebody's uniform that they were in combat, and it tells you if you know the units, what unit they are in. In this particular case, it's the 30th Medical Brigade. They're out of Europe, and they have a long history, and so those folks I served with my first time. This little shield up here tells me that I'm an officer in the medical command, and that has a whole history behind it too, including the rooster, which I won't go into. And then this little badge, these are unit awards as opposed to individual awards. And what this one tells you is my unit that I was in received what's called the Meritorious Service Award, and in this case, where you see two little oak leaves or oak pieces there, tells me we've been awarded it 3 times. So that kind of stuff. Over here, these tend to be personal things. At the top, they're actually what are often called traditional medals, and you would wear medals if you were really fancy. So that tells you things that you've won, and it tells you how many times. So this is Meritorious Service Award. I've gotten that 4 times. And then there are other ones that go down. Probably the only other one here that I think is important is this middle one with the stars. Those are campaign stars, and that's my ribbon from Iraq, and it tells you I've been in 4 campaigns in Iraq. And campaigns really are just sort of ways that they delineate different missions or periods of time in Iraq. So, anyways, yeah, you can tell a lot about where people have been and what they've done.
I was just about to say that was so informative, and it tells a story.
Yeah, it really does. And of course, combat arms guys have a lot more.
And then you have the caduceus, right? Is that?
Yes. Oh, you're talking about up here. Yes. So what you do is, again, we're medical, so we have the caduceus. The S indicates we're Medical Specialist Corps, which is a corps that's specifically occupational therapists, physical therapists, physician assistants, and dietitians. And there are several other corps. Medical corps is strictly physicians, nursing corps, strictly nurses.
That was so interesting.
Yeah.
Now I got to remember that.
Yeah.
I'm going to test you later.
No, please don't.
So let's start at the beginning.
Sure.
You've been in the military for how many years?
18 years at this point. I started very late.
You were how old?
I was 40.
40. Wow. That's that's unusual.
It is certainly in the traditional thing of any movie you've ever seen or certainly experience in high school. most people who go in, yes, they go right in like out of high school, that kind of thing. Medical is different in that usually in the military you can go to school within the military, but typically you don't. You join after you graduate college. Now in my case, I graduated college, I went, was an OT, did my OT practice, got married, had my son, and then, as I like to tell people, my wife, and she is somewhat chagrined by it, told me when I was 40, this is the last year you can go into the medical side of the Army, because you can go in later, obviously, because they want your skills as opposed to the fact they want you to run around and shoot weapons. So I did. I joined, and that was in 1999.
That's great. That's great. She didn't join with you. How come you didn't do it at Tucson?
Oh, my wife Marjan had zero interest in joining the military.
Well, let's go back in time. You're an occupational therapist.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Why did you decide to go into occupational therapy?
That's an interesting question. So when I went to school in 1974, I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and my intention at the time was to be a psychologist. That's what I wanted to do. Always had an interest in counseling and did it in high school. We had like a peer counseling thing that the school, guidance counselors ran. So always had that interest. So I went to the University of Pennsylvania because that's where I had a full scholarship, so that made that choice easy. When I got there, I quickly realized that the school really is into experimental psychology and linguistics, nothing to do with counseling. It was all rats and mazes and what do fish do, and how did the geese imprint on the researcher? It was all that. So I really was feeling kind of like, wow, this is not going to work out for me. It's not my interest. The person I was in those days, we had at Penn, there are houses as opposed to dorms. And the senior students who kind of oversaw us in the house, one of them, she was an occupational therapist. And she said to me, when I talked to her about it, she said, Kevin, you might want to look at OT. I said, oh, okay. So I very diligently went over to the library, found a book on OT. Now, that book came from the 1940s, and it was a military OT book.
Oh my God.
So when I opened it, it was all about, working with soldiers and doing essentially vocational kinds of endeavors that they were doing, getting them back, into society. And I thought, wow, this is great, because it wasn't just talking to people, which has its value. It was actually having people do things to reclaim their lives. And that I thought was just perfect, and I loved it. So saw that, so I contacted the OT school at Penn, which was called SAMP, School of Allied Medical Professions, and got an appointment to go over to see one of the professors. And went to my appointment, sat down, I was 19 at the time, and the instructor, the professor, looked at me rather, I want to say dispassionately, but I actually think she was a little bit unhappy to see me. And her very first question to me was, are you here to meet girls? Now, you have to keep in mind that as a single young guy at 19, of course, it came out with the most flippant possible answer you could have, and my answer was, why, you got any? So, because I had no clue that the profession was predominantly female. I mean, that's not something that ever was indicated in the books. They showed both male and female OTs. I had no clue. Yeah, she didn't really like that answer. But anyway, once we got past that, we kind of were able to come to the conclusion. I really was serious, and I did have an interest, and she was willing to give me a chance. So I did go into the program there, and I'm really pleased. Although I have to admit, there was only 2 other guys in the class.
Yeah, we're starting to see more men come into the profession. So what is it like when you were starting out to be a man in a profession that's female dominated?
Well, number one, you could never find a bathroom. I can tell you that right off the bat, because all the bathrooms had the label in our school, they've all pretty much been changed to female. So there was just 1 or 2. So that was the hard part. But other than that, it really was, honestly, it was fun. I mean, the coursework was interesting. It was fun. You could never skip class, because immediately you're like, hey, Kevin's not here, because you kind of stick out. But all in all my classmates were great colleagues, and helped me because I came in a little bit later. In that program, you actually started as a freshman and took a class and worked your way through all 4 years, because it was a bachelor's at that time. and I had a lot of fun, and it was really interesting, and loved it.
So you get your degree, your bachelor's degree in OT. How did you launch your career? Where did you go next?
Well, certainly, as I think you might have guessed, my interest was mental health. So for me, when I looked at, even though I did my physical dysfunctions affiliation and my mental health affiliation, that's what I wanted to do. So I initially looked at jobs around, and even though there weren't tremendous number of OT jobs at that point in the 70s. I did get some offers from places I was interested in, but the state of Pennsylvania still had the very large, complex mega structures for mental health, the big state hospitals. So I worked at a place called Haverford State Hospital, which was out in the suburbs. It was a gigantic campus. I think in its heyday it probably had well over 1,000 patients. Because as you know, in that system back in the 40s and the 50s, people went there and lived, and they stayed there. I actually had a few patients who were born there, and were still there.
So as the non-OT voice in this, it's always interesting to me to learn about the role OT plays in mental health. We discuss on this show often that OT is found across many different fields, and that one to me is always and they do that too. And so for folks who might, like me, not know that, could you describe for us a little bit what that work looks like?
You know, it's interesting. In my mind as an OT, what I do in mental health is zero difference from what I would do in physical dysfunction, because it is indeed the activities of daily living, from the most basic to up to pre-vocational to work skills. So as you know, most of mental health effort or treatment effort in this country is, of course, partly medication, but usually didactic interaction, talking. Well, that's great, and it's useful. People need to gain insight into themselves. But I always found that once you talked about how you wanted to change or what differences you wanted to make in your life, you needed to practice it. I mean, to simply say to a patient who's very introverted and doesn't want to go out in public and is afraid, you can't just say, well, you should just go out in public. You should join groups. You should be more active. Somebody needs to walk you through that. And I always found that was part of our role. And part of that would be, indeed, how do you appear? How do you dress? Are you clean? Because in our culture, if you have an odor that's unpleasant, no one's going to interact with you. You must get past those basic skills that our culture expects of you to function. Then take it a step beyond that. How can you really interact? You can practice social skills. You can practice talking and interacting. And those things can be basic, like going to the store and making change and buying products. You know, those are ways that you're very structured, that you can get people to learn how do you interact and talk to folks. And of course, that leads you all the way then to job skills. And yes, of course, there are all vocational counselors and job coaches, although I don't think we really had job coaches in the 70s. But it really is, again, giving people who struggle with emotional barriers or psychological demons or whatever terminology you want to use, those things that block them from being able to function in our society. OTs, we give people the chance to, let's practice it in a safe way, a non-scary way, take it, control it, step up each time. So I'm very passionate about what OTs do.
And now, after you describing that, I see very clearly now when you talked about first going into college and being really interested in psychology.
Yes.
And how you, in a way, that plays out in your work now as an OT in the field.
Sure.
It does. And you know, I graduated in '79, and one of my field works was at the VA Day Treatment Center.
Excellent.
So I was working with Vietnam veterans who had mental health issues.
Sure.
And exactly what you were sharing, we actually went to a bar once a week.
Very good, yeah.
And we would sit at the bar and we would talk about how can you engage in speaking to someone when you're at a bar. It was fascinating for a beginning OT to think about the impact you could have to help with social participation.
Yeah, I agree completely, and wonderful work, because I think the tendency or the risk for those individuals is that they would be afraid and therefore would drink and overdrink and consume, so that they become then, inebriated. And so excellent.
So I'm going to just reinforce or underscore something. I think, just like you said, that we're all mental health occupational therapists. you can't, or occupational therapy practitioners, you can't separate the behavior and health from anything else we do.
I think that's a good point.
It is. I think it's really important. So now we're going to fast forward
Okay.
to where you are now. We went back in time, now we're going forward. What are you doing now?
Well, of course, I live in this world of the civilian world and the military world. So on the military side, at this particular moment, I do policy review for the Army, which is completely uninteresting, but I do it from the point of view of an OT, so I make sure things don't affect us in a negative way. But most of my career in the Army was in what was called a combat and operational stress control unit. So when I deployed to Iraq, what we did is we went with groups of, on our team there would be a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a social worker, a psychiatric nurse, and we would interact with soldiers while they were deployed in Iraq or Afghanistan for those who went there. So our population was essentially a well population, but dealing with tremendous stress because war basically is incredibly stressful. Not only the experience there, but all the worries at home. So how did people cope? So as an OT, one of the primary skills that we looked at was how did soldiers interact with their families and loved ones at home? So a very simple task was, by the time you get to Iraq, everyone's emailing. So what would happen, and as I'm sure you've all had this experience, people would be upset, angry, whatever, and they'd email and they'd hit send, and then they go, wow, I wish I hadn't sent that. So we did a lot of education with soldiers about how do you do that without regretting what you're doing. So simple things like write your note out first, type it separately, then put it into the email. Just very basic kinds of thinking skills and learning and teaching folks how to deal with, a lot of times, anger and frustration, and what are the appropriate ways to deal with that. Getting sleep regimen, that was probably one of the biggest things we did, was educating soldiers about the importance of sleep and maintaining sleep. Mm-hmm. And so when you came off a 36-hour mission, you didn't immediately go to your hooch and drink Red Bull and play video games. You actually need to sleep before you go back out on your next mission. Or one of the things we would do too is we'd go out to the small patrol bases and we'd talk to commanders and do an assessment, and we'd find out that their soldiers weren't sleeping, and you go, well, why? And you'd look at the room they had set aside for sleep, and you realize it's the only room they were using. So that means if you're trying to sleep, you were in there playing video games or talking to me, and so of course we were making too much noise. So we just taught them things like have a sleep room where only people sleep.
And there's increasingly more research coming out that shows that a healthy sleep cycle will benefit or is related to your mental health.
Absolutely.
And good health in general.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly the more stressed you are, the more important to have that balance to help you stay grounded. So we did a lot of that. So that's the Army side of what we did. A lot of expressive media, those kinds of things, which were amazingly
So what did you do for our viewers, expressive media? What were they doing?
Well, I stumbled onto something called cowboy poetry.
Oh, I want to hear about that. That's intriguing.
So cowboy poetry is simply a genre of poetry, and there's actually a big national conference that happens out in Nevada every year in Elko, that where people write about being in the cowboy out in the West, cows, lonely, desert, dry places, austere environments. And what I found was that it did relate to a lot of the soldiers. So what we would do is we'd get soldiers together. Typically these were folks who were having trouble managing their anger and frustration. So we first would introduce them to it, and then what we found is that we could then teach them to essentially write their own version of that. Because it was again, these are mostly a male populations, so it's very male, it was kind of masculine, hey, there's nothing wrong with being associated with cowboys, that kind of thing. So we actually taught them essentially to write poetry as a way to express themselves in a way that didn't get them thrown in the brig and into fights.
That's very clever. Yeah.
I never heard of that before.
Wonderful. Yes, Elko, Nevada, if you ever want to look it up. They do it every January. They have a big conference.
That's fabulous. It would be very cool to publish some of those.
It would. I don't know that I saved any of those things, but yeah, there may be a few around. But they were, because they were often very heartfelt, and certainly for many of the soldiers, very private kinds of things. But it was a way for them to really talk about how they feel in a structured, safe way that they were able to find acceptable for themselves, because that really is hard in the military, to be expressive about your feelings.
Sure, to express your feelings at all, anything.
Yeah, 'cause, yeah.
So, military
Yes.
OT. Now, what about civilian OT now?
Okay, so when I first deployed, I had been a director of occupational therapy at a place called Shaughnessy Captain Rehab up in Salem, which no longer exists. So when I came back, while Spalding kept a job for me, that job was gone. So what happened literally the week I came back is Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, and the Liberation War, or the anti-Gaddafi war in Libya, was taking place. And a lot of folks, Europeans, were coming together to say, hey, we should help rehab all these freedom fighters who've been injured. And of course, the United States said we would do that too. And Hillary Clinton said, well, Secretary of State, we're going to take 25 of them. Great. For whatever reason, and I don't know the reason, they picked Spalding Rehab. So Maureen Banks, who's the president of Spalding Rehab, said, Kevin, I have a job for you. And what I did then was coordinate the rehab program that we set up for the 25 Libyan guys who came for rehabilitation at Spalding. So it became so we set up the program. Obviously, it had all the treatment aspects, but also the cultural aspects. We contacted mullahs in the areas, and I found that there's actually a fairly active expatriate Libyan group here, and we engaged them, and we tried to make sure we set up for their cultural and ethnic needs, and provided obviously the treatment too. So I coordinated that. That got me started into the thing of coordination. So then the next thing I did was I coordinated the move from the old Spalding building on Nashua Street to Charlestown. So now, I think on the surface people might say, well, that has nothing to do with OT, but I would argue that both those jobs and all the subsequent coordination projects I did are absolutely OT jobs, because they require you to assess your clients, who are all the people you're working with. Where are they at? What are their skills, their abilities? What are their fears and concerns? How to bring them together to interact in a purposeful way, set up structured activities on how they have to learn their new jobs and where they're going to go, and how is your job different here at Nashua Street as opposed to when you go down to Charles. And it really becomes a very large, sort of more population-based OT endeavor, where you're looking at how do I maximize the success and function of this group of people from one location and into a new one, and get them there in an organized fashion so that they're prepared, so they can think ahead and plan. So I see it as OT.
Yeah. I do too. I think
so
it's
interesting.
fabulous.
And it almost to me seems a bit of a touch of organizational psychology in there as well.
True enough. And of course, from my point of view, we do actual activities like planning activities and role playing and practicing. So that, to me, makes it more OT, because again, there's this actual doing
hands-on
component as opposed to just,
But this would be such a great article for you to write about, because we want to be population based.
Yes.
And you're working with well people.
Yes.
So it comes together so well to show that occupational therapy has a distinct value in doing that.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent for us, or have a belief in. We have this traditional roles we've always had as OTs in classic healthcare, and that's important and vital. But on the other hand, I do think we have skills that really offer themselves in many venues. And even though I can't sit here and tell you that was like a purposeful plan on my part to do that, I've embraced it, because it really is. As I've gone along, I've come to realize I'm doing what I want to do. It's just not the traditional activity.
It's fabulous.
Yeah,
Really
and we're
is
so lucky to have learned about all of that and to have you on our show. And I think it just, again, goes back to what we've said before, is that you find OT everywhere. And I think that's one of the joys of having guests such as yourself on our show, to share that and to share this information, because it's so useful, and it can be inspiring, especially I'm thinking of the young OTs who are perhaps in college and studying and thinking about, okay, where am I going to take this next? Because it seems like the opportunities are, they continue to grow.
And they are. The job opportunities in OT, I think we're ranked, top 10 professions to go into now. So you are an inspiration. So we're so happy to have had you on our show.
Glad to
Thank
be
you so
here.
much, and we feel educated. I'm going to test her after
Absolutely.
to see
All right.
if
Excellent.
Off camera.
But thank you so much for being on
You're
the
Thank you,
show.
Kevin.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on our show. As always, we appreciate you spending time with us. Please feel free to check out other episodes online. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on brooklineinteractive.org, on the cable stations in Brookline, and on Karen's blog.
On my blog, too.
So thanks again, and see you next time.